It's really a pleasure to be back meeting with other people in the TAS collective. I haven't been able to travel to come to the previous conferences. So in a sense, this is giving me an opportunity to meet with you all again, given that we're on Zoom. So that's great. Today I want to be talking to you about challenging the representations and assumptions of out-of-field teaching. And last time I was with you in Dublin, I did talk about some of this work that we were doing. And so what I'm presenting today is sort of, where are we now? Because that was 4 years ago, Dublin. So what's happened in the meantime, and how has that influenced our thinking about this issue? So why do we need a critical lens on policy? Because this is the focus of my talk, thinking about education policy and the way in which policy represents out-of-field teaching. Why do we need to bring a critical lens to that policy? What's the problem? Well, one of the big problems from my point of view and the data that's collected about the incidence of out-of-field teaching is the inequities and the need for to bring an equitable and a social justice perspective to this issue. We know that the teachers who are teaching out of field are not evenly distributed around the communities in our country, in Australia. They're very much located in rural and low socioeconomic areas, in remote locations. The data from those international tests tell us that there's unequal distributions. We know that the work for the mentor teachers and the leaders of the subject areas is greater in schools where there are more out-of-field teachers, and in that case it happens to be in the low socioeconomic, rural and remote and typically disadvantaged schools. So if we're concerned about social justice, then we've got to be thinking about what is the policies that are enabling this to continue, and how do we interrupt it. We also know that apart from having an impact on students, there's also an impact on teachers themselves. And we know that some teachers are adaptable and see it as a learning experience and move on, whereas others don't. And the research over a period of time has indicated that this practice of asking people to teach outside of their area of expertise contributes to what I call teacher churn. That is, teachers leaving the profession altogether or leaving the school in which they're working to go somewhere else and to teach somewhere else. And typically that means they're shifting from low socioeconomic schools to higher socioeconomic schools. Our work is on this is informed by critical theory, and for me, the social justice lens in particular around the ethical debates in mathematical education, because that's where I come from. I'm a mathematics educator, so quite a lot of the examples and instances that I will use will be in that particular field. But it is worth really thinking about what it means for all of the subject areas that are implicated. We had a number of research questions, but the ones I'm wanting to focus on today are thinking about what are the representations and assumptions of out-of-field secondary teaching made by governments in Australia. So we're looking at governments. Now, we reported on that particular question back in 2016, but the second research question here is, but how have these representations, assumptions changed in the past 5 years? Have they changed? And what's changed about them? And then thinking again about how these representations interact and impact on the perspective and experiences of schools and particular principals and out-of-field teachers. So we're looking at thinking about how we can challenge or contest some of these perspectives that are implied in the way that governments put their policies together, respond to the incidences of out-of-field teaching or don't respond, and how that is leads to there being quite a few silences, and what are those silences, as well as what are the effects, because we can see what the effects have been. But what do we have to do in order to interrupt that? And I think that's the really important work. Our work in research is about how do we make our research have an impact? How do we use what we know and what we're learning to make a difference, not just in the classroom with the schools that we might be working with, but on a broader level. So that's where I'm thinking about. The BACCHI process of doing analysis, policy analysis, using this problem representation idea is one of trying to figure out what the problem is. We know what the problem is. What are the assumptions that underlie the representations that government use? What effects are produced, what's left unproblematic, and what are the silences? So I'm not going to talk too much about the effects, but how could these dominant problem representations be contested or disrupted? So as I said, we've been collecting data about this project for quite a long time. Initially, we looked at a whole lot of government policy documents, and because Australia is a federation, we have a number of states plus a Commonwealth government. And over time, the responsibilities for education have shifted backwards and forwards and around between either being a state responsibility or a government or a federal government, Australian government responsibility. And they try and carve up these responsibilities. And of course, there's some interactions there in between who's responsible for what when it comes to education. So typically the states are responsible for school education and the Commonwealth is responsible for higher education, in particular universities. But then there's some funding things that the Commonwealth comes in over the top of and does some things. And they've also have some overarching policies about the qualities and requirements for registration of teachers and qualifications of teachers. So all of those things happen at the national level in our country, but the states run the schools, the government schools. It's complex. So we looked at the different states and the different, as well as the Australian government, to try and identify how out-of-field teaching was represented in the various documents and what were those underlying assumptions. And since then, since we spoke back in 2016, we've conducted, Linda and I and Russell and Coral, we've all been working on our out-of-field or teaching across subject boundaries project, where we've been working with schools, a number of schools across Australia, and really understanding what actually happens for these teachers over a period of 3 years. So we've been constructing narratives about the schools, the principals, the mentors, and particularly the out-of-field teachers. And that's enabled us to identify some of the effects and silences in the government policy. And now let's have a look again. Well, where are we up to? What's happened in that time with respect to government policy documents? Are the same representations still there? Have the assumptions changed? What's going on? So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So previously, these were what we initially found when we looked at all the different documents. Nowhere in any websites or any of the documents at the time were they talking about out-of-field teachers. There was only one state government that did openly talk about out-of-field teachers, and that was our small little island state down the bottom, our little Apple Island, Tasmania. And they were the most open about acknowledging that there were teachers who were teaching subjects without either the technical qualifications or without the training. So again, I know Linda's going to be talking next about those definitions. So that's really important. So a lot of it was about, oh, we don't have enough teachers and that's why it happens. And there's a whole teacher shortfall. So there was a whole lot of things about how do we attract people into teaching, and the Australian government set up a project called Teach for Australia, based very much on the Teach for America project. Then there was this whole view, oh, well, it's really because we've got all these hard to staff schools and people don't want to go and teach in those schools. And teachers don't want to stay even after they've been there. And we know this is something that happens right around the world, that there are places and locations, and pretty much there's a whole deficit perspective then on those schools and working in those environments, and that goes along with that. So it's kind of ends up being a little bit of a deficit perspective, and in some instance might even end up being blaming, but that might be going a bit far. The other representation of out-of-field teachers in our country is the idea of teachers being less qualified. And this happens because while there are requirements for secondary teachers for them to have completed or concurrently undertaking study of particular subjects that they're going to be teaching, whether that be physics or science or languages or mathematics, that there's the content knowledge being developed through that study, and then that's required before you can enter a teacher education course. But once you've done the course and you go to register as a teacher, you only are registered as a teacher. So that means that a whole lot of principals in our schools, where principals can appoint their own staff, are just saying, well, they're a qualified teacher and I can appoint them because they're registered and they're approved. And then there's the whole issue about what is teacher quality, and the standards and things that are set and written down there about the expectations of what teachers should know and be able to do, but not necessarily making any connections between the experience and knowledge of teachers that are asked to teach some subjects. So we found all of these discontinuities in the representations. So what's happened in the meantime? And again, my colleagues on our project are probably going to report on various aspects of this work along over the next couple of days. But one of the things that we know and we've always had from our work is realising, and our studies confirm this, that our teachers who are teaching out of field do use their knowledge and experiences in their teaching and develop their teaching of their out of field subject. And in some instances, we've been able to document the way in which those experiences have influenced for the good their teaching of their in-field subjects. But the degree to which they're adaptable and develop confidence and develop knowledge depends a lot on the culture of support that they get within their school. And pretty much it's all about that. It's not very much about other things from outside the school in terms of what the government is providing and additional support. And so the things that we identified were a critical friend, time and resources, professional learning, collaborative planning, teacher agencies, and those all things needed to be in place for teachers to feel comfortable or develop some comfort in their out-of-field teaching experience, as well as develop their knowledge and expertise. Now, what's happening now? Okay, so we go and have a look at what's on the website for the Victorian Government's Department of Education. And we find reference to hard to staff positions as opposed to schools. So they're not talking about the schools that can't find teachers. They're talking about the subjects that they can't fill, and in particular the STEM subjects. So the Victorian government and all the governments around Australia are feeling under a lot of pressure because the federal government is really pushing STEM education. They're also supporting that, but they're sort of really focused on the hard to staff positions and the out of field teachers really being maths and physics teachers. they're completely ignoring that the highest number of out-of-field teachers is in technology, that fits in their STEM area, but they're not referencing it. And they are acknowledging that those positions are harder to fill in some locations, the rural schools and the disadvantaged schools. They're also seeing it as a teacher shortfall issue, and therefore there's a need to retrain other people to become that, because they cannot see the supply chain being able to fill the group. And there's always the idea of teacher quality, although there's a bit of a suggestion now in some of the words that they're using, as opposed recognising that it's about the quality of the teaching as opposed to the qualities of the person. So the hard to staff, here's a bit of a picture from the website. The hard to staff thing, what they're wanting to do is provide financial and non-financial incentives for people. And so while they've recognised that the finance doesn't work, they've recognised that non-financial incentives has to work. They've said schools can apply for funding to support their new maths and science teachers, particularly in these schools, but they haven't really provided much in the way of professional learning. They're expecting networks to kind of happen, but there's no attention to out-of-field teachers. It assumes that this is all for in-field teachers. Again, there's an issue of teacher shortfall. They're seeing that it's going to be acute over the next 10 years. And they're still seeing this idea of wanting to improve the quality. And they're understanding that there are some generalist teachers, primary teachers now, because we have schools in Victoria that go from P to 8 or P to 9, and a lot of primary school teachers who've been trained to teach maths up to grade 6 and now doing it up to grade 8. So they are starting to recognise content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge as being important. They have started to use out-of-field teaching, especially in tender documents where they're wanting to get assistance from people, and they want to know and understand more about it as they provide particular services and retrain teachers to teach in these must-needed situations. What's prompted them to make these initiatives? Some of the research that we've done to model the shortfall, the evidence of out-of-field teaching, the fact that other states in Australia do have accredited courses for professional learning. So now Victoria wants to do some of those, to run courses for teachers out of field. But the overriding thing is still Victoria wants to improve its results in its national and international test data. It's looking at improving averages, not necessarily in solving the social justice question. So we need to keep contesting about accredited professional learning. We need to keep contesting with them about their recruitment and their allocation strategies and how to support schools. We need to be focusing on what the school culture is and how to support teachers and principals with workload adjustments and other professional learning support. And we need to be thinking about pre-service teacher education and the people who are graduating realising that they might be asked to teach a subject that they haven't trained for. I'll stop there. Sorry, I went over by 2 minutes. But I didn't want to talk too fast. I can do that.